Pottery. Not only is it a form of ancient art, but a gateway into the past. Pottery is a form of storytelling, rehearsing the stories of humanity, documenting the events, people, and culture of each era. Though with uncertain origins, we can uncover the truth by starting at the beginning. In pottery, it all starts with clay. So really there's three main types of clay. We have earthenware clay, which is more of like a low fire clay, which goes from cone 06 to 1 usually. It's more coarse, it's easy to work with, and when fired it's still porous. Stoneware is a mid-fire clay, so that's from cone 04 to 7, or a high fire clay, which is cone 8 to cone 10. And it's called stoneware because of its stone-like characteristics. When fired, it becomes a lot more durable and hard, and at that point it's no longer porous. And then the last type, which is a very high fire clay type, it's called porcelain, and it's cone 10 or higher. It's known for its strength and durability, and it's really smoothness.
The term ceramics, lots of people use to mean this stuff, just pottery. In my definition, ceramics is the end product. It is not clay anymore. It has been fired to the point of what we call vitrification. So if I were to take this and hold it up, and you can hear it ring like glass, this clay has been fired so hot that it has vitrified. In other words, it's waterproof. This is ceramic. The stuff I made it with, even when it was completely dry, clay, could be broken back down into clay again. That can never happen in human time, in geologic time perhaps, but pottery is the product. It is the thing. Typically it refers to functional objects, cups, plates, bowls, that sort of thing. Ceramics, when people talk about ceramics in this regard, this being ceramics, it usually sort of encompasses the whole field of ceramics, so sculptural, decorative, functional like I do. It's a broad brush that people paint what we do with. But pottery, my true love, is functional stuff typically. It can border on the decorative. I've done that too, I still do. But it always refers to the functional vessel, as we call it, the vessel.
Section off a piece, seal up the bag, because if you don't seal the bag, then you'll have a rock hard piece of clay that you have to rehydrate, which is awful, speaking from experience. You wedge the clay to remove any type of air pockets and things like that, to kind of warm it up, because clay has a bunch of particles, and when they sit for a long time, they're kind of like a stubborn old man stuck in a chair. They need to be warmed up before they can move, so you wedge it with your hands, kind of kneading like a dough motion, in order to kind of shift those particles around and get them unlocked.
The oldest, we think, they kind of cross-pollinate again. We're not 100% sure, but pinch pots, where you take a ball of clay, you stick your thumb or your fingers into it, and you use your thumb and your fingers to work around the pot, and you pinch the clay between your hands to form a vessel, eventually thinning it out, hopefully getting an even wall thickness, and you make a shape.
What I have heard or read is that it kind of just happened where like kids would like be playing around with mud and by the fires, and then they would kind of throw it in there, and it was the clay that then became vitrified, and they were like, oh, it's ceramic now.
Okay, so I've been told a lot of things about this. I don't really know. I'm gonna say a blanket statement of I don't know, like factually, but I've heard that it is from like somebody forgetting that they had a fire going and then a whole village burning down and like, oh my god, our clay pots are now vitrified. Just kind of mistakes happened and then really great products came from it.
Pottery is an ancient art form filled with a lot of mystery. It's not yet fully discovered, as anytime we dig in the dirt, we often find new forms of pottery.
We call it the ancient Tupperware because everything was stored in pottery. Terracotta, unvitrified pottery, is porous. Liquids held in it seep out through the surface, and when wind hits that, it cools the environment. The first air conditioner was born that way. What we think is when we were still a nomadic people, somewhere most likely in Asia, Russia perhaps, that area, and then constantly moving. Somewhere, someone along the way came across naturally occurring clay in a pond or a river, some body of water. They either stepped in it or fell and put their hand out and then realized that when they removed their hand or foot that it retained the shape of that, and that this would have made that material different than what they were used to seeing, like mud or dirt or sand. What I call an aha moment most likely occurred then. We know they had basket weaving technology at the time. Somewhere we think somebody would have realized that stuff, because it holds its own shape, or the shape you give it, that they would have taken that slip, we call it liquid clay, or very, very soft clay, and lined a grass basket with it. And that made it waterproof, so you could carry water back to your people. Then we think that basket somehow fell into a fire or burnt some way. And technology being precious, the very few things they had, they would have gone back to recover something. And then they would have found what was left over inside of that basket. The grass is gone, but the clay is left behind, which is now ceramic. It has forever changed. That would have been the aha moment. Not only would they realize that this stuff was hard and rigid and retained its shape, and more importantly than anything, protective. They would have flipped it over and seen the grass pattern on the back, and decoration was born at the same time, we think. I think it's a romantic story. I love telling it. I think it's probably true in many regards, but this wouldn't have happened in one moment. This would have been over many, many years and generations where they refined this. And what we know now is that it happened in different parts of the world in some places about the same time. Clay exists naturally in the earth, a lot of it. And so for us to stumble upon it, our ancestors stumbled upon it, was inevitable. Now making that connection of taking this stuff, then figuring out you can make something out of it, and then figuring out that fire changes it. That's the story. And that's the story I don't know the answer to. There's coils, which you just take clay and you roll it out into, a lot of people love to call it snakes of clay. It's a coil or a rope of clay. And then stack them on top of each other. You can smooth them together. You can leave them looking like coils.
I am Cynthia Cuevas. I am a student at UTD, and I've been doing ceramics for roughly 4 to 5 years, I would say. I was drawn to ceramics because of the historical aspect of it. It's so fascinating and interesting that you can see what a civilization or a group of people were like just based on the art that they showed in the pottery, or whether or not like the people were advanced and what stage that they were at, so type of clothing they wore. So my preferred style is experimental. I like to challenge myself and push myself and push the medium.
Chris Gray. I am the professor of ceramics here at Collin College in Plano, Texas. I go through phases. Style is an interesting thing in art. I think people that know me and know my work can tell when I've made something, and I think that just develops over time. We all, as makers, have a different type of touch to the material, and so I think we sort of, if I may use a hoity-toity word here, imbue ourselves into the work just by touching it, and then years of experience behind that will help with the shape and form and then the glazing and all that stuff. I think most of my stuff will always revolve around food and drink. Functional pottery is my dear love. I love it more than anything. One of my paths in working is relatively new to me. I've been doing it for 11 years or so. I make frying pans now. There's a special clay called flameware that's thermally shock resistant. This stuff, if you put this over fire, it would shatter. But a specialized clay body called flameware doesn't. And so I've been making frying pans for years. And to backtrack a little, I originally wanted to be a chef. I love cooking. But I realized quickly that I did not want to do that for a living. 80 hours a week on my feet just sounds like hell on earth. But I can combine that love with this love, a style emerges. So when you interject what you love in many different ways into what you're making, a style is born or it starts to emerge.
Slip is, in the most basic term, just liquid clay, and how you make slip is you would just take dried clay and then you'll put it in like a little airtight container. You don't really want to put it on any one that has metal on it though, so you want to keep it to like a glass or a plastic one with a screw-on lid, and you'll put water in it and then you leave it, and then it'll kind of re-solidify, and the more water you add, the more liquidy it'll get. So some people like it to be a bit thicker, some people like it thinner, kind of just depends. Slip is commonly used as a type of glue in ceramics.
The earliest known stuff were actually figures, what I lovingly refer to as pocket gods.
Statues of like deities, and also what I've heard them refer to as like kids' toys, where it's just like these tiny little statues.
Because we were still nomadic, everything had to be small and light, and we had to be able to carry it, pack it up and go. Our ancestors would have needed a god for everything, and that would have been survival to them. So carrying your ceramic pocket god with you was survival.
Coil pots specifically originated in central Mexico after pinch pots were made, and then it started spreading north. It took nearly 2,000 years for the technology to travel around to Arizona area, where early pottery in the United States began to form.
The earliest known fired ceramic object is from the modern-day Czech Republic.
It was this small little figure about 4 inches tall and 1 inch wide. It was thought to be created roughly 29,000 BCE or all the way up to 25,000 BCE, and it was called the Done Vestinice. And they probably carried her around as she most likely represented fertility.
So that's 30,000 years from now. That's shocking to think about. But the earliest known, right now anyway, because history changes every time somebody digs somewhere, especially in Europe and China, the earliest known functional pottery that we know of now is in China. I believe it's the Jiangxi province, and it's around 20 to 24,000 BCE. Which predates villages. So what we thought before was that pottery didn't exist until we settled in one place and they could make a kiln and do that kind of thing. We now know it wasn't that. It was way earlier. They found these pot shards in a cave in China. And they carbon dated the stuff that was in them, so the charcoal on it, because they used them as cooking vessels, was able to be carbon dated. Same with the food inside. Most pottery had some survival significance. If I had to distill it into one word, it would be survival. But so was being able to cook food, sterilize water. They didn't know they were doing it, but they were. And to drink things and to store things and keep them safe from vermin was a big deal. Only later, when we had the luxury of being in a place, living in a protective dwelling, we could focus on decoration. But to this day, pottery is still used for the original things, which is use, I think.
Life and living, like you can see everything from like other countries where they're still, building pits and digging it and doing kind of primal forms of ceramics, all the way to expression in its weirdest forms where it's just coil sculptures that mimic the female form. So everything from existing in daily life, eating, to expressing yourself and finding a way to exist in your own personality.
The earliest slab-built pots were still after both the pinch pot and the coil pots, and what it was just rolled out clay that then you would form into your item. So either you could still keep it flat, or you can make it into a cup. You can put it in things, over things to create that form, and then let it dry out and it'll stay that shape. Slab building techniques were often used by Mesoamerican pre-Columbian potters. Most pieces from ancient time are either coil or pinch pots though. Ceramic slabs, interesting enough, were also called ceramic tiles, and they were found in places such as the pyramids, the ruins of Babylon, as well as ancient Greek cities. slabs, the reason why they're kind of important is because it's really easy to make patterns on it. So if you were to lay down an item on top of it, you can roll over it or push into the clay and it will directly transfer that image. For instance, another civilization that did that was Sumerians. They created this item called a cylinder seal that was used not just in clay. It wasn't made just in clay. It was also made from stone, bone, ivory, and other items, but they did use clay to do it. And what it would do is it would make a raised impression whenever rolled onto clay tablets. We still kind of use this method of these cylinder seals. We have like what are called texture rollers, and it does the exact same thing.
As you get older, you tend to look to the past more, and I have done that a lot with my work now. I continually look to the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Koreans. And because they were all very close to one another, many things sort of cross-pollinate, so to speak. Again, I make functional work, and so I always look back to those cultures. But I still mix in other cultures. I look at early, what would be modern day Iran. I look at some Greek. I love pre-Columbian Americas, South, Central, and North American native pots. Aztec, Mayan, that sort of thing, Peruvian. But it always has to do with functional stuff.
One of the wonders is why are we finding these pots and why are the dig sites where they are? And personally, I think it's because of the fact that that is just where the resources were. So pottery was invented, we were still nomadic and we were just traveling where the resources were. And so, in the sense, just as though if shepherds were traveling where the grass was to feed their cattle, then it's the same thing with clay. If early potters were looking to make items to store their foods and goods, it'd be the similar sense where you need to find resources for the clay, and then whenever they didn't need it anymore, they would just drop it.
Steps to creating ceramics is either making or acquiring clay, having your idea, and I would think of like its purpose, like what it's going to be used for. Do you want it glazed or raw? Once you have your idea, like the building part comes in, and I think that's like the most difficult part, because depending on what you're making, I like to sculpt more than do pottery. So you have to like kind of like think as you go, like what am I gonna do this with? Like what tool am I gonna use? Or can I do this with my hand? Type of thing.
I'm Jordan Easley, and I'm a former ceramics instructor. This would be my fourth year. I had been working a job where I was mainly focusing on words and ideas, and I really wanted to have something that would kind of connect me back to, the earth and like reality, and so working with my hands was something I wanted to do, and this was a way I could express myself and do that. The style that I've developed is eclectic, you could describe it as, because it's literally whatever I want. It's however I feel. I prefer to throw on the wheel. I'm not as big of a hand builder as I am a wheel gal, and I like to make functional pieces, so I guess if you were going to give a style, that would be it. But primarily just whatever I feel. I kind of like to let the pieces decide how they're going to be to some extent and go with the flow.
The pottery wheel is an example of early mechanical inventions, and it traces back to the ancient Sumerians as early as 3000 BCE. It was basically just this disc that you would sit in front of, and it would have this little indentation in it, and you would have this really, really, really long stick, one that you could put over your head and reach all the way across the wheel, and the wheel was pretty big, it was pretty large, and you would take that stick, put it inside of that little divot and push off in it, and it would spin your wheel for you, and you would just start forming your base, your item, your vessel, whatever you wanted to. And it wasn't until the early Bronze Age, about 2400 BCE, where the next wheel was made, which was made by the Egyptians. It was one that you would sit at rather than sitting on the ground, and it had two wheels, and this one is commonly referred to as the kick wheel. And so what you would do, you would sit down in front of the wheel, and you would kick off on the bottom wheel, and it would turn that top wheel. The first evidence of the pottery wheel was found in Egyptian paintings.
I'm very attracted to the Japanese style. I like clean lines, I like simplicity, I like functional, so I really like Japanese work, but I guess I would say that's where my favorite is, yeah.
It's super important that you control your speeds well. So whenever you're centering it, you want it to be really, really quick. That way, whenever you're pushing in, you have to use less force, and it will center a lot easier.
Once the clay is on the wheel, you first begin by centering it, which is basically allowing the wheel to spin and use centrifugal force. And you're pushing in with one hand while trying to basically get all the clay evenly distributed at the very center of the wheel. Once it spins cleanly and you don't see kind of a lopsided spin, that's the point at which you sink your well.
Whenever you go in to do the well, you also want to make sure that's still pretty quick.
The potter, they've got lots of different strategies, from using one thumb to using a finger, whatever it may be. Everybody adapts to what works best for their kind of physicality. So you sink your well, and then throughout the process you add water if it gets too dry or if it's starting to harden, because you are touching it a lot and your hands absorb moisture from it, at which point you begin pulling the walls. You do have to be cautious about water being stored in the base or how much water you're adding to your clay, because as you add water, the particles separate and thus make it more plasticky or malleable, which if it's too malleable, when it gets high, it will flop, as many people have seen.
Whenever you're building up those walls, you want to slow down your wheel pretty significantly, because if you have it too quick, often whenever you're pulling the wall, it'll pull it uneven. And so you want to have it pretty slow so you can take your time to pull up each level of the wall. And similarly, whenever you're shaping it, you want it to be that consistent speed of whenever you are shaping the walls. If you're throwing on the wheel, you want to make sure that your posture is really structured. So what I heard it referred to is the power triangle. So what that means is that your body and your arms and then your face all make a triangle form. And so what I like to do actually is to make sure that I'm extra structurally sound, is that I'll sit really close to the wheel, and then you have your foot on the pedal. So I'll put my arms kind of nested really close to the crease that my leg and waist make together, and then you want to go bend over your pottery and you'll start centering in on it. And then once you have that made, it's best whenever you're pulling up on the walls that you go on the side of your vessel.
You create the form that you want. Oftentimes it allows, or it requires time for drying so that you can, trim the base of it instead of just having a cylinder. So there's lots of stages of that. Let it dry, trim the base, wire it off.
My name is Zosha Coffee, and I'm a ceramic artist and student. Professionally for like 4 years, but before that, as a kid, like ceramic's kind of been sprinkled into my life. So like I have clay ornaments I made with my cousin when I was 5. I did not know really that you could really be an artist and like actually make money off of being an artist until I got to college. When I came into college, I was a biochemistry major. Quickly from there, I kind of slid into the art world, and the second I got my hands on clay, something I think chemically changed in my brain and was like, this is like, you can't ignore this nagging feeling in your head that this is something that is part of who you're meant to be and the greater version of your life.
Trimming is very useful in the pottery world because what it had done is it created uniformity in pots. So you would usually flip over your item and secure it to your pottery wheel in some way. I like to use clay just to secure it there, and you want to make sure that it's centered whenever you're trimming. That way, whenever it spins around, that it has a nice even bottom. Whenever you're trimming, what you're gonna do is you're just gonna take your item, make sure that it's centered, and then you'll take your tools and you'll just go up the sides and the bottom of it. Some people like to add on what's called a foot, and it's basically just like the circle of clay that's at the base of the pot that raises it above the surface ever so slightly without it being directly flat. The reason why you would trim a foot on it would be to make it so that whenever you set your vessel on the surface of whatever surface you do, it's more even and it won't have like a wobble on it.
So one of these things that has kind of popped up in my life as a ceramic artist that kind of has like pulled me towards that is Polish pottery. I'm from, like, my family's Polish. I'm a citizen of Poland, and my mom has a very deep connection to Polish pottery. Polish pottery is a form of pottery making anything from plates to bowls to ladle, like literally everything. Everything in my house is Polish pottery. And it's blue and white ceramics with like some red, orange, green details.
The reason why you would trim the foot other than for decoration purposes would be to help dry time. If your item is too thick before putting it in the kiln, often it might not dry out completely. And so whenever water is stored inside of a vessel or an item, then it tends to like crack, or what some people call explode in the kiln, which is whenever water cannot escape out of the ceramic item. All the pressure gets built up inside of the clay walls, and then it'll just kind of like crack or so other forth. One of my favorite type of feet is the Japanese feet. They're so unique and so beautiful, and there's different ones for almost every single one of their items, specifically in like their tea ceremonies. You can just look at like one specific item and there'll be like 20 different feet, and it's just so unique, and there's so many varieties, and it's a great source of referencing whenever you want to switch up your ceramic feet. Usually you would trim items whenever it's in its leather hard state, and so that's whenever the clay isn't quite yet at that bone dry or greenware stage. It's still malleable, so whether that means to add a foot or even if you want to carve into your item, that's the best time to do that. Carving is just whenever you take your tool and you just etch out designs inside the clay.
For it to dry fully. Once it has fully dried, it becomes what's called bone dry. And so once it's bone dry and all of the moisture has left the clay, you put it into the kiln for its initial firing, which is called the bisque firing.
The term cones just refers to the unit of measurement whenever you're firing clay. Usually that ranges from cone 22 all the way up to cone 10. If you were to fire clay to a higher temperature than what it was supposed to be, then the overall appeal of it could be warped. So a kiln is basically an insulated chamber that can be heated to very high temperatures for firing or burning or drying. Like for instance, other than using it for ceramics, you can use it for glass, metal, and other materials. There are different types of power sources for kilns, so there are like wood-fired kilns, coal-fired kilns, gas-fired kilns, and electric-fired kilns. Gas and electric are the most common ones currently. The first kiln was actually just a fire pit, and then in between that kiln type and then our current ones were multiple different types, such as beehive kilns and climbing kilns and other many types. Whenever you're firing a kiln, it's super important that wherever you're firing that kiln, the area is really well ventilated. Kiln can release super toxic fumes, so you don't want to have a place that's not ventilated. Most kilns can come with some sort of vent system, either a downdrafted vent system or an updrafted vent system. With the kiln, there are different types of elements, so there's not just the kiln itself. Within the kiln, there are items such as the plugs, and what they do is they'll seal up your kiln to help with circulation better, and then whenever it's cooling down, you can unplug those plugs. But you gotta be really careful whenever you're doing it because you don't want to shock those items by having that cold air get into it. Then we also have kiln shelves, and now kiln shelves are really important because what the purpose of them is to protect your kiln itself. You don't want to put your ceramic items ever on the bare bricks of the kiln. You want to make sure that you have a shelf on the very bottom, and you want that shelf to be elevated ever so slightly to help with circulation. And then for the actual kiln shelves to protect them, you can add a kiln wash, and that can come in either a powder or a liquid form. How we would add different shelves onto another shelf is with the use of columns, and columns can come in so many different sizes. And one of the most important parts of the kiln, the thermocouple, that is a little device that is inside of your kiln already. And what it does is it measures the temperature of your kiln. It's really important to make sure that whenever you're putting items inside the kiln, that you leave a good amount of space in between it, roughly an inch. And then we have our pyrometric cones, which what their intended use is to be another step in monitoring how your kiln is firing and how you can make sure that you really understand your kiln. Some kilns tend to fire a little bit hotter than others, and some tend to fire a little bit cooler than others. It kind of just depends on your environment. So what the pyrometric cones will do is whenever they melt, they will arc depending on the temperature in the kiln, and that arc will tell you whether or not your kiln is firing too hot or too cold or just right.
After the bisque firing, you get what's called bisque wear. It's super absorbent. The particles are not fully fused yet together, so they can still take on things and absorb rather than being not being porous, we'll say it that way. Glaze is a mixture of different components, but the way I like to describe it and the best way to understand it is that it's basically liquid glass. So whenever it's heated to the designated temperature that specific glaze requires, it hardens and creates a non-porous kind of clean seal for ceramics, and it just makes it all around nicer to touch. So there's multiple types of glazes. You know, different glazes serve different functions. You've got glazes that are purely decorative, and those are not considered to be food safe. And then you have glazes that are in fact food safe, or sometimes described as like dinnerware safe, depending on the packaging. But those are kind of the two main categories that I operate under: food safe versus not food safe. And then beyond that, you've got glazes that come in different forms. Like you can purchase powdered glaze that you have to hydrate yourself and turn into a glaze, and that's oftentimes used for dipping. So it's dipping rather than brushing. And then you have your just regular glazes, which you brush on. So there is a difference between brush glaze and dip glaze. You can't use them for the same thing. They don't come out the way they look. And that was one of the things that blew my kids' minds, was that glaze, when you look at it, is not what it actually appears to be. Oftentimes, like a glaze that turns out blue may be red when you paint it on, or a green is going to be gray, just depending on the elements, because it's all about chemistry.
Wax resist can be applied on the bottom of your pots to prevent glaze to stick to your kiln shelves during firing. That's like the main use of wax resist, although it has been used for decorational purposes, but it is what its name is, which is to resist the application of glaze, slip, or underglaze. Before being used in pottery, wax resist was used in Indonesia on their fabrics to make their Indonesian Baltic fabric designs. Other than that, it was also used in drawings, and it still did the same purpose, was to resist whatever medium you were applying to your art or your piece. It wasn't until about 1200 years ago that wax resist was actually used on pottery.
The glazing process can be as complex or as basic as you want, whether it's one layer, many layers, but you have to let it dry between each, so it does take patience. Even if you're doing one type of glaze, depending on the method of glazing, you have to do multiple stages. And then once you're finished glazing it, you let it dry and you fire it one last time, and that creates your glazeware.
I believe glaze was introduced like a long time ago, really long time ago. And I think this is again one of those stories that I hear, like somebody accidentally broke a bottle into a fire pit and then they put their clay item in there, and then boom, all of a sudden it's like a glass but clay ceramic thing.
Glaze is made with some sort of flux or a melter that lowers the melting point, and then a stabilizer that bonds the glaze to the clay, and some sort of glass form like silica. Whenever you want to add color into your ceramic, what you would add on top of those 3 items would be a colorant. So usually those materials consist of some sort of like iron oxide, copper carbonate, cobalt carbonate, and some sort of opacifiers, including tin oxide and zirconium oxide. Other than using cobalt, copper, iron, you can also throw in some magnesium, nickel, and rutile. Some other less common are gold, silver, uranium, and other rare earth metals.
Different washes are very cool because they can create different kind of effects in the glaze or in the piece. So you wouldn't necessarily have to use a glaze. It kind of serves as a different form of color. Again, just chemistry being its cool self.
The types of washes are copper, iron, magnesium, rutile, and cobalt. Those are the main ones.
In my materials class, I use a lot of crawl glazes, and so I've made some really cool crawl crackle glazes.
What we think is the first true glaze was most likely an accident, like most of this stuff was, in Egypt. 4,500 years ago or so. And it's called something we call Egyptian paste. I don't know if you've ever seen any of this stuff. In ancient Egypt, they would make these little figures. The most famous ones that we saw when I was learning was these scarabs, these little scarab beetles that would be in burial tombs. And they're this beautiful bright turquoise blue, also called Egyptian faience. It was an accident, most likely, like all good things. The metallic oxides and the salt and the clay and then the firing method, we think they probably used cow dung. Cow dung is rich with sodium and grass. And so copper, sodium, and then somewhere in there, some sand got in the mix, silica or quartz, and it made the first glaze, a decorative colored glaze that is one of the most beautiful colors to have ever existed. But perhaps earlier than that, the Chinese, who we owe everything to in ceramics, really, were developing glazes a little bit by accident as well. The firing method for them was wood. They were the first to develop stoneware, the stuff that's waterproof and does not need a glaze to be waterproof. Low fire earthenware, like we know the Native Americans and Central and South America, and all over the world really, needs a glaze to be waterproof. This stuff doesn't, but the wonderful byproduct of it was that the wood that they used to fuel the kilns and get that hot temperature turns to ash. That ash flies through the kiln, lands on the pots, and melts into a glass. And so that was the first true glaze. And then there would have been that aha moment, and they would have figured out the stuff they were digging out of the ground. Each one does a different thing, and through centuries of testing, they would have developed glazes. So it happened in different parts of the world in different ways. And nailing who was first is kind of tough. I still think we'll find out that it happened earlier than we currently think. But the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, which is modern day Iran, and the Chinese all sort of developed their own, which are still done today, by the way.
A new type of glaze technology came out, and it is basically underglaze transfer paper. And so what it is it'll have some sort of design that was created with underglaze, and then you'll take that out, you'll take that paper, you'll cut out your design, or take the whole paper, place that on your pottery where you want it to be, and then you'll take a damp sponge, and you'll just dab it on your pottery. And what it'll do is, it's kind of like a temporary tattoo where you'll put it on your pottery and then you'll just peel off that paper and it will leave the design in its place.
The cautions. So this is where ceramics gets a little bit spooky, because everyone sees it as this passive, like calming thing, but they don't realize the hidden dangers. So dangers of ceramics, anything from when firing, the fumes that are coming off. The primary danger in ceramics is your lungs. There are some additional dangers, like when making your own glazes. Things like cobalt aren't things that you want to have touch your skin. There's some things that you don't want to absorb. So there will be glazes that actually say, don't let this get on your skin. Like I had one called Mirror Black that you could not touch to your skin until it was fired, but then it was food safe post-firing. But other dangers would include silicosis. That's the biggest one. And then just being exposed to fumes in general. So when doing pottery, the cleanup is one of the most important parts of the process, because how you clean is safe. If it's not clean, it's not safe. If you ever walk into a studio that has clay dust all over the ground, or chunks of clay all over the ground, a layer of dust on shelves, that's not a studio that's kept to the standard that you want to be in. So silica is basically a particle that is not visible to the human eye, and when breathed in, it actually goes into your lungs and kills little pieces of it, to not get too technical with it. And it limits your lungs' ability to process oxygen. And before they really knew about the dangers of silicosis, you had a lot of potters that would dry sand pieces. So like once you fired a piece, it's got a little sharp spot. So, I want to get that off, so let me just sand it down real quick, because it's very possible. But what they didn't realize is, as they're sanding these pieces, they're breathing in particles that are creating not temporary damage to your lungs, but permanent damage. So it's not I do this and then in a month I'll be okay. It's a slow build. The more you expose, the more danger you build, and some people end up having to get lung replacements, or a lot of potters that are from the 70s and 80s have passed from silicosis related damage. So dry sanding, anything dry, like in pottery, wet is safe. So if the clay's wet, you're good, but you never sweep a dry clay room. You never let chunks sit on the floor, because then when they're stepped on, it kicks up silicosis or silica into the air, which can cause silicosis. And that's not something that's just in pottery, that's present in a lot of different fields, but pottery is one that people tend to ignore the dangers of it because it seems so harmless.
My name is Isabel. I am a ceramics student at UNT, and I'm also an employee at Color Me Mine Flame. I took my first introductory ceramics class at community college in 2019. So when I first went to college, I wanted to be a photography major, but one of the first art classes that I took was the ceramics class, and as soon as I was there, I was like, this just feels right, it just felt like it was very fun, and I liked that it was hands-on, and I didn't have to be looking at a screen as opposed to photography, and I could feel everything happening physically with my hands too.
Pottery manufacturing is anything from toilets to sinks to some of these things that I have behind me. Things that generally are mass-produced amounts of pottery.
With the growing population of ceramics, many companies have started to use it as a form of business opportunities. One common one is Color Me Mine in Plano, and you can come in there and basically pick out whatever items you want, and they have a wide variety. Sit down, paint with your friends, and in about 2 weeks you'll get your beautiful items back.
I think there's a big difference between somebody who works in ceramics and somebody who is a ceramics artist. You can have the knowledge of how to do things, and you can have the technical skill for it, but it doesn't mean that you turn it into an art. Where you turn it into an art is where you introduce expression and choice and personalization.
I lately have been really drawn to talavera. It's more of a decorative element characterized by its bright colors and intricate designs, geometric and also organic. And it was introduced to Mexican potters during the Spanish colonial era. I grew up seeing that throughout my life, in my home, in my grandma's home, and all throughout Mexico whenever I would visit. Like, it's such an iconic style and you see it everywhere. And even though it's like been around for a really long time, you still see it almost modernized with these new designs that are attributed to like album covers from like artists today and stuff. So it's like really interesting to see how like even though it's an old style, it can continue to grow.
I have an expression, ceramics will break your heart, because it can all go wrong at any given moment. Ceramics shrink as they dry, and when shrinkage occurs, cracks occur a lot of times. That's the big one. When it's greenware, it's super fragile, so it's real easy. I mean, you could just squeeze it too hard and break it. You could glaze it and it could still turn out like crap. It could be ugly. It could, there could be glaze faults, what we call shivering, where the glaze pulls away from the pot, or crazing, where it cracks. There's problems with clay bodies, dunting, where it bloats out real big, or that's bloating actually. Dunting is where it just cracks as it cools. There's just all sorts of things that could go wrong. So that's why it's amazing when you get a piece out of the kiln that you love, that turned out the way you wanted it. It's kind of rare. My professor then, who was a grad student, gave us all balls of clay and told us basically how to do a pinch pot. And so there was that moment where I was holding that clay in my hand, and then I took my thumb and pushed it down in there, where you go down in like that. And the second my thumb went into the clay, I knew. Never did it occur to me to be a professor until the late part of grad school, when I realized that I wasn't cut out to be a studio potter at all. I don't necessarily want to call it my calling, but I guess it is. I enjoy the few, and that's going to sound bad, and I don't mean it to, but there are these few who click with it, and you see the light switch on in a student's eyes, and in that moment I realized, geez, this is an amazing occupation, to be able to not just teach and expand somebody's knowledge of something that they would ordinarily never look into, but to see that look on somebody's face and then imagine that that's what my face looked like when I stuck my thumb in that clay, is a real high for me.
Being a ceramic artist is having the ability to connect to nature as well as my culture. I love working with clay because it's a substance that can come directly from the earth, and it's just so interesting that you can use the little earth to make anything you want.
Ceramics to me is frustrating, and it is also the best time I've had in my entire life, and it's also simultaneously like, why did I choose to go this way that I did? But then also it pays off a lot. You're in your soul, you feel it. So to me, like, being able to have the privilege to work with ceramics every day basically is like a connection to my earth and a connection to my home.
To me, ceramics is a form of meditation and an escape. It's my way to connect with myself, process things. If I'm having a really bad day and then I just can't deal, it's a place where you can go and just everything quiets. So whether you're actively processing or not, it's a release, it's an escape. For me, it really is a form of meditation, because you can sit down on the wheel and think that you're just going to sit down and make one piece, and then 6 hours later you're like, oh man, I'm feeling stiff, because you've just been so in the zone of your body creating something, and it's a really beautiful art.
Could say everything, but it's not. I mean, that's a little bit grandiose, but it's a lot to me. I have a roof over my head. I'm driving a really nice car. I have a job. I have benefits. I mean, those are the obvious answers, but philosophically, the idea that 10-year-old little Chris, who was only concerned with whether I was going to swim or fish during the summer, can make something with his hands that will be around forever. Something that a lot of people find beautiful, that they want to use, that they will part with their hard-earned money for. That's it's not just an ego boost, it's moving. The idea that you can create something that other people love is, not to overstate it too much, it's godlike. I am, or you are, whoever's doing it is the creator.
Ceramics honestly has taught me patience.
Patience, patience, patience. Not just ceramics, but teaching ceramics has taught me patience.
It would be to be patient, because it's a long process throughout every stage. I think it's a lot of waiting time.
In ceramics, you can experience the same failure over and over and over again, but if you stop, you're not going to go anywhere. So there were days where I would just sit over the wheel and cry, because I had failed so many times, but it's when you reach that one spot where you get the success and you get past the failure, you're like, oh my gosh, this is worth it. So ceramics was really the first time that I experienced something where I could sit there and get myself to the point of tears, take a break for a second, like go walk to the bathroom, walk back, and come back with that same, like, okay, I just need to keep going. Like, it taught me the patience and the value in putting in time despite failure.
Expectations can be very bad. So you have to temper your expectations. When you go into a situation, you might not get the outcome that you wanted. How are you going to react to that? Ceramics has taught me that it's, oh well, on to the next thing. For me, it's on to the next cup or bowl. But in life, it could be a major decision. But the big one is patience.
The first hurdle I encountered was understanding that things break. That you can put weeks into something, waiting for it to dry, firing it, put your whole soul into something, fail 100 times before you make this, and then you're walking and you drop it and it shatters.
Don't get frustrated if it first doesn't work out. I see so many people who want to throw, and this happened to me. Like, my first semester of throwing, I was terrible at it. I was really bad.
Oh my gosh, centering was such a hurdle for me. That was the one that got me to almost to tears.
When we learned to throw on the wheel, I was terrible. Absolutely horrendous. So bad I quit. I went my entire undergraduate career without throwing any pots. I hand built the entire time. Only when I went back and basically ended up joining grad school or going to grad school did I get back on the wheel.
And the last couple of weeks of my class, I finally got it together, and I could make something that resembled a bowl.
And as you know, it's just one failure after another.
Because you sit there and you try and you try and you try and you can't figure out what it is. And then I met this girl named Sin, and she provided a couple suggestions, and they just, like, that worked.
So I think my biggest thing is, like, don't give up. It really sucks at first because you feel like everybody around you can do it so well, but we were all at a point where you've been.
So I would say a mix of centering, and then the big one that I learned that's more of a applicable life lesson is things are going to break and you can't do anything about it. Just because you put a long time into something doesn't mean it's going to last.
My advice is to learn ceramic history, where this comes from, who did what and when, and to stop believing social media. Now, here's my old man moment. I told you earlier I was going to get off my lawn. This is it. Too many young makers look at social media and take a person with a bunch of followers as an expert. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Are there experts on social media? Absolutely. But do not learn only from that. There are these things called books that have pictures and words in them that you can learn from. And our history is written down very, very well in a bunch of these. In a library, that's a big building with those books in it. Workshops, attend workshops of other artists making their work and talking about it. Nothing is more valuable than that. Get out there, see other potters, talk to other potters, ask questions. But more than anything, don't believe the internet. It's a great source of information, but there are a lot of people out there posing as experts that are simply not. The fact that so many students don't know who Peter Volkis or Warren McKenzie or Shoji Hamada, they don't know those names, is very, very bothersome. It's troublesome. It's scary. And they don't. So I would just say, get a little bit old school in your learning. And I know I sound like an old man, but it's a big deal. It's a big deal.
One warning I would say is that you're gonna get, like, if you give yourself the time to actually experience ceramics, you're gonna get hooked on it. Like, and not only that, it's expensive because you'll see that glaze that you like and you're like, oh, I have 5 glazes, but this one's different, and you buy it. So it's definitely an investment, but it's addictive. That's what I would say is the big warning. Got to be careful not to get too hooked.
Do you feel like you've mastered the art of ceramics?
No.
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 Hell no. Not even close. I could live 3 more lifetimes and not master it. There's too much.
And I feel like if anybody looks at you in your face and says, I've mastered the art of ceramics, they're lying.
And like, I don't think anyone can. I don't think anyone really ever will.
I don't think I'll ever master the art of ceramics. You know, there's always, like, that's my favorite part about it, is there's always something new to learn. Once you feel like you've figured out how to make the coolest cup or the coolest vessel in the world, well, how do I make a lid for it?
Because like, there's just so much that you could do with it. And like, even like when you think like, oh, I've got this part of it down, like there's still like a whole nother part of it that like you might not even know about. It's just such a big subject.
There's too much to learn. There is in no way, shape, or form any way to master this stuff. Am I better than some people? Yes. Am I worse than some people? Oh yeah, a lot. But I won't have mastered clay if I live another 50 years.